Hello, everybody, and welcome to our live stream of my inaugural speech. I'm going to introduce the Dean at Academica University of Applied Sciences now. Laurence, over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Haili, and welcome everyone indeed for this official installation of Haili Hughes as a professor, instructional coaching. And we are very honored that Haili is part of joining our professor team that is working as doing research on improving the quality of education. Haili, thank you very much, and we are very happy and proud to have you on board.
That's so kind. Thank you so much, Laurence. And I'm very, very proud to have joined Academica University of Applied Sciences as well. So I'd love to welcome you all tonight. I'm very, very excited about the research that I've done and the agenda that we've put together for you this evening. I'm thrilled to be working on this webinar tonight with my co-professor, Professor Jim Heal, whose work on mental models is just absolutely transformational across the sector. So Jim has joined us as part of this webinar as well tonight, and he'll be speaking shortly after me as well. So we're going to start out with my inaugural address, which is based on a white paper on instructional coaching that I've produced, and everybody who's registered for this webinar tonight will be able to get a copy of this white paper as well, and we will also provide a download link as well to this on our LinkedIn pages and on our website as well. That'll be then followed by Jim, who's going to do a fantastic quick lecture for you on the importance of mental models in teacher development, and then back over to me to actually join the two together. So, what does this actually mean in terms of instructional coaching and the refining of teachers' mental models and what we mean by that? So let's jump straight into it. If you do have any questions or comments at all, please do put them in the chat. We'll try to address them at some point during this session. And welcome to everybody who's joined us. I can see we've got Helen there from Tucson, Arizona, so we've gone international, which is fantastic. So my research question that I've looked at is really an exploration of the Education Endowment Foundation's effective PD report, and actually what does that really mean for us as school-based instructional coaches? Just a bit of context, I am actually still based in school. I'm a director of professional development at 11 schools in a multi-academy trust in Merseyside in England. So I combine my professorship with that very practical role, which is why I'm incredibly passionate about all of my research being something that helps real teachers on the ground and really helps to shape and change their practice. So we're going to get started on this now. Now, some of you may be reading this PowerPoint now, having a look at this picture, and you may be thinking, yeah, I recognise that picture. Now, if we know that teacher quality is the most significant in-school factor which influences pupil outcomes, we know that from research by Rob Coe et al. in 2014 for the Sutton Trust, then surely effective PD is one of the most cost-effective levers that schools have for their improvement. Yet, as this picture suggests, professional development quality varies widely. And many teachers report that PD does not improve their instructional capability. So this is where the EF came in. Their review of 104 PD studies revealed substantial variance. While PD is positive on average, poorly designed PD can waste time or even actually harm practice. So for those of us who've been in the classroom ourselves, that negative experience of teacher learning may have been a really common experience. Hours and hours every term, sat in a school hall, listening to training, which doesn't seem relevant and rarely actually made that transfer into classroom changes. And this is why the EEF's research on professional development is hugely, hugely transformational and important. Their report has been so transformational to school leaders because it's brought together a large body of evidence to answer a deceptively simple question. What makes PD actually change teaching and improve pupil outcomes? And what this research did is it drew on systematic reviews and trials and concludes that PD is most effective when it activates what the EF term as specific mechanisms. And these mechanisms are the building blocks that really change teacher behaviour. So this report, it sits on top of a growing literature showing that PD can improve both teaching quality and pupil learning, but with highly variable effect sizes. So systematic reviews, meta-analysis by Harry Fletcher-Wood and James Zuccalo and Sam Sims et al. Also found that well-designed PD can have impact comparable to reducing class sizes or adopting new curricula. Yet, as we say, many of these programmes have negligible effects. And Kennedy's 2016 review of experimental PD studies makes the same point. Essentially, PD is not inherently effective because its impact actually depends on how it changes teachers' underlying reasoning and repertoires, not on whether it's labelled as coaching, lesson study, or workshops. So this EF report, it shifts that conversation away from the forms of professional development and their simple structural features, such as total hours, towards the actual mechanisms through which PD exerts its influence. And you can see those mechanisms on your screen now. There's 14 of them altogether. So, synthesising evidence from this systematic review and the wider literature, the EF has identified these 14 mechanisms of the most effective and impactful professional development. And these are then grouped into 4 different sub-functions. So we've got building knowledge, we've got motivating teachers, we've got developing teaching techniques, and embedding practice. So what it tells us, this report, is that PD that activates more of those mechanisms from across the 4 groups tends to have larger and more reliable effects. And that also mirrors the findings of Sam Sims and Harry Fletcher-Wood in their critical review from 2021, which argues that traditional design features like duration or collaboration only matter insofar as they enable underlying mechanisms such as practice, feedback, or reflection. And Kennedy similarly proposes that programs differ mainly in the problems of practice they target and the mechanisms they use to address them, not in that superficial design features, which I think is something that we've focused on very much in the past. So I'm going to take each of these mechanisms in turn very briefly and describe to you what we mean by these groups. So we've got building knowledge, and the report stresses 2 mechanisms as part of that. We've got managing cognitive load and revisiting prior learning. So what it tells us is that effective PD helps teachers understand new ideas without overwhelming their working memory. And it does this by sequencing content, using worked examples, and limiting the extraneous information. And we know that that is consistent with cognitive load theory, which shows us that instructional design must respect the limited capacity of working memory to support learning. The second mechanism, revisiting prior learning, that reflects the strong evidence on retrieval practice and spacing that we know about. Rodiger and Carpike, for example, showed us that testing and recalling information leads to better long-term retention than restudying alone, and that spacing those retrieval operations boosts that durability of learning. So the EF therefore recommend that PD revisits key ideas over time. It incorporates opportunities for teachers to retrieve and apply concepts, and it deliberately sequences learning so that new ideas connect to our prior knowledge. So let's have a look at mechanism group B, which is motivating teachers now. So it outlines setting and agreeing meaningful goals, using credible evidence and role models, and providing affirmation when teachers make progress. So let's look at that goal setting. So lots of research around this area also supports this emphasis that this is really, really important. Locke and Latham synthesised 35 years of studies that found that specific challenging goals agreed with participants and accompanied by feedback consistently produced higher performance than vague, do your best exhortations. And the EF also highlight the importance of credibility and trust. Teachers are much more likely to engage with PD that's led by knowledgeable experts or a respected peer and framed in terms of robust evidence. And that resonates with Cordonley et al.'s review, which finds that sustained collaborative PD involving specialist expertise and structured peer support is much more likely to change practice than one-off events. Now, at the organisational level, Kraft and Pape's research in 2014 also showed us that teachers working in schools with that strong professional environment, which is characterised by supportive leadership, collaboration and useful PD, improved substantially more over time than colleagues in those weaker environments, even with similar experience. So the implication here aligns with the EF, that effective PD is not just about content, But it's also very much about climate. Teachers need to feel psychologically safe, professionally valued, and confident that the PD they're doing is worth their very, very limited time. And let's face it, that's something that teachers are really, really short of, is that time. So our group C now. So this really foregrounds mechanisms, and I think this is a major contribution of this report that moves beyond knowing to doing. So we've got that explicit instruction in practical techniques. We've got the modelling of those techniques, the guided feedback on attempts, and the rehearsal in a safe environment before and after classroom use. So I'm going to hone in a little bit here on deliberate practice, and that is not the same as experience or repetition. Just doing something repeatedly does not lead to expertise. And as Erickson differentiates deliberate practice from just repetition, what deliberate practice involves is the performance, so doing the activity in real time, that feedback that's going to feed forward with clear performance goals, and the opportunity to correct the errors, and that strong mental model, which Jim will talk to you a little bit later, of what effective practice really looks like. So we know where we are, where we're going, and in a really tangible way, how to get there. So we're on to our last group of mechanisms now, which is embedding practice. So this group of mechanisms is all about providing prompts and cues, prompting action planning, encouraging monitoring, and prompting context-specific repetition. So in PD terms, what this tells us is that teachers are more likely to sustain new practices when they've got a clear action plan, specifying when, where, and how a technique will be used. They receive prompts and reminders at the moment of need. So for example, checklists, cue cards, emails. They monitor their implementation, and they have opportunities for that context-specific repetition. So trying the same technique across multiple lessons and different classes. And the EF argues that many PD programs underperform because they stop at the training stage and they fail to support behaviour change over time. So effective PD, by contrast, includes concrete supports that help teachers turn their intentions into habits. So overall, what does the EF report tell us? Well, it tells us actually for school leaders, what's really important is that we balance mechanisms across the four functions. And PD is most powerful when it builds knowledge, motivates teachers, develops techniques, and embeds practice. If we only focus on knowledge, for example, or only on motivation, that's insufficient. It also highlights the need to not over-rely on structural proxies. So longer collaborative programs does not mean they are automatically better. The duration, the collaboration, or the external expertise are useful only insofar as they enable the core mechanisms such as modelling, rehearsal, feedback, and follow-up. It also highlights the need to align PD with the science of learning. Effective PD mirrors how people learn. It manages cognitive load. It builds on prior knowledge. It uses retrieval and spacing. It encourages effortful practice, and it gives timely feedback. Obviously, I think it's Dylan William who uses the phrase, everything works somewhere, but not everything works everywhere. And we've got to also attend to our own school context and the professional environment. And supportive leadership gives time allocation. It makes the priorities really coherent, and it shapes intentionally a culture of trust. And you need all of those things before the PD mechanisms can even operate at all. And again, that echoes Kraft and Pape's findings that professional environments powerfully influence teacher growth. And then finally, we've got to plan for implementation from the start. And I think this is something that we do quite badly in education. We seem to run from one thing to the next. And what effective PD does it designs built-in prompts. It has action planning. It has self-monitoring. It has that context-specific repetition that's consistent with wider evidence that implementation quality is a major determinant of programme success. So I've told you all of this. I've really kind of succinctly put together the research that the EF found in this report. What has this got to do with instructional coaching? Well, what I'm going to propose is that perhaps instructional coaching is the solution to implementation. And that's what I'm going to kind of set out to you today as my solution for this. Now, instructional coaching has emerged as a really promising approach to developing teacher expertise. And there was a paper in 2018 by Kraft, Blazar and Hogan, which claimed it not only has a positive impact on teacher performance, it also has a positive impact on student progress. And yet, like any form of professional development, it's got to be understood not as a monolith, but as a set of processes. And indeed, the EF actually highlights the problem of forms. Two programs which are labelled instructional coaching, can differ dramatically. And any search on the internet will prove that point. Instructional coaching has an identity crisis, and when people use that term, their mental model actually of what that process looks like could be completely different from somebody else's. And that might include different frequencies, feedback type, or rehearsal expectations. And there are only three things that might differ. When actually, perhaps what matters more are the mechanisms, those actions that reliably shift behaviour. So, why instructional coaching? Well, for me, instructional coaching is quite distinct, actually. From lots of other forms of professional development. It's individualised, it's context specific, it's ongoing, it's not one off. It typically includes observation, feedback, modelling, and rehearsal, and it creates that protected space for goal setting and practice. It also includes accountability and support in manageable regular cycles, and those features align very strongly with EEF's mechanisms. And because coaching relies on frequent contact, it also naturally enables spaced retrieval and that iterative refinement. Yet, for a really busy school leader wishing to implement instructional coaching in their school, it can be difficult to know where to start. And there are a plethora of different platforms and courses that they could invest in, and many are using coaching models that they could embed in their schools as well. However, I think the EF's PD guidance report is also a really useful tool in helping leaders make sense of exactly what an instructional coach should be doing in their daily interactions with their coachees. And my white paper that you'll all get after this lecture by the end of the week examines how the 14 mechanisms can help teachers actually become better instructional coaches and what that means for designing effective coaching systems. So we're going to go through the really practical stuff now. How do we become better instructional coaches based on this behaviour? And we're going to start off by mechanism group A, building knowledge. And the irony of having so many bullet points on here when I'm talking about managing cognitive load, that is because they are on an animation, and the animation does not work on StreamYard. So I promise you, and Jim Heel will back me up on this, he's seen the slides, they do come up one at a time. So it's the transient information effect in action now. I do apologise, folks. So, mechanism A, group building knowledge. So, as we outlined, the EF identifies these two mechanisms: managing cognitive load, revisiting prior learning. So, those principles, we know they're really foundational to cognitive science, and they've got significant implications for coaching, I think. And the guidance really emphasises that PD has got to reduce that unnecessary load and offer clear examples and focus on the most relevant content. And we know that that's critical because human working memory is limited, as Sweller et al. Told us. So, instructional coaching, I think, is uniquely positioned to manage cognitive load because it focuses on one small high leverage change at a time. And those techniques are broken down into component parts, action steps, before being introduced in practice. And that modelling provides worked examples that reduce that intrinsic load. So what can effective coaches do? Well, they can identify a single actionable step. And I would really recommend you have a look at the work of Paul Bambrick Santoyo here, which really helps teachers avoid that overload. It can be quite tricky when you've got lots of things to improve to think of the highest leverage. What's going to do the thing that's going to make the biggest impact in my classroom? Coaches can prioritise classroom routines or explanations that free up teacher capacity. So you can do things like rehearsing, scripting things, practicing in low stakes environments. Instead of giving coaches lots and lots of lists of disconnected strategies, you can connect advice to a shared mental model. And I've been doing a lot of work on this recently alongside my fantastic colleagues who I've written a book with on coaching for adaptive expertise, Adam Colbeck, who I think is on this call. Hi, Adam, and Sarah Cottinghat. And, it's that idea of actually coaching is all about making better decisions. And to be able to make better decisions, we need to map out the thoughts that are in our mental model and create a shared mental model of those as well. We can break up complex strategies. So things like retrieval practice into steps, into action steps. We can use worked examples through modelling, through video almost even, to reduce that element interactivity principle. And we can introduce progressive complexity. And that's something I want to talk a little bit about. So Josh Goodrich, who's the CEO over at StepLab, wrote a brilliant book in 2023 called Responsive Coaching. And in that book, Goodrich argued that novice, competent and expert teachers learn in different ways, and therefore they require very different forms of coaching. Now, a one-size-fits-all coaching model is not only ineffective, but it can actively overload teachers. And Goodrich tells us that novices, for example, need really high scaffold with tightly focused steps. Developing teachers might need more increased autonomy, and expert teachers actually need really complex adaptive challenges. So, as a coach, it's about us being really agile and really adaptive and responsive in the way that we support our coachees. And Goodrich also emphasises the importance of adjusting the balance between challenge and support depending on that expertise. So that's really, really important. So there are lots of things that we can learn from that group of mechanisms. So on to our next group of mechanisms now, which is motivating teachers. So what can we do as a coach? Well, this is all about setting goals, which I think is bread and butter of what we do, and is actually got the potential to be one of the strongest behaviour change mechanisms. We improve performance when goals are specific, challenging, and ideally, in an ideal world, agreed collaboratively. Instructional coaching is inherently goal-driven. It's got the potential to embody this mechanism perfectly. And when done well, goals in instructional coaching are personalised, observable and time-bound. So our teachers commit to trying that new technique or decision-making or step, whatever you're working on in that next lesson. And coaching platforms like StepLab can also enable teachers to self-track those goals. So there are lots and lots of different scripts and feedback guides that instructional coaches might use to help frame their goal setting conversations with teachers. I really like the 3Ps format. I think it's quite simple, but it's also effective, and it stands for precise, practical and proximal. So I'm going to talk to you a little bit about that. So precise means that the goal must identify a really specific, clearly observable and unambiguous teacher action. And not only does that remove that interpretive ambiguity, but it also enables focused rehearsal, and it ensures the teacher and the coach share the same mental model. So, for example, rather than having a goal of improving questioning, it'd be reframed to use cold call by asking a question, pausing for 3 seconds, then selecting a pupil. And that precision really prevents overload by narrowing that target behaviour. Practical really ensures that the goal describes an action the teacher can realistically perform in their next lesson and can be directly practiced during coaching. And it makes improvements so much more actionable and tangible. It builds procedural knowledge through that rehearsal, and it avoids that abstract or conceptual goal that doesn't translate into behaviour. So again, another example, use more formative assessment strategies becomes, after each explanation, use a show me board check with at least 3 follow-up questions. And then finally, proximal. That ensures the goal's near term, it's achievable within days rather than weeks, and it represents the next logical step in a teacher's development, not a leap too far ahead. And that again helps to build momentum, early success, and supports that habit formation. It also ensures that cognitive load is at the right level of challenge, and it matches the teacher's expertise, which is central to that responsive coaching. And now more than ever, instructional coaches have got access to really quality, trusted sources for research, which, really speaks to that idea about being a credible source. Yet there's also the risk, isn't there, with increased blogging and social media, that something which might seem really evidence-based could actually be a lethal mutation. And therefore, instructional coaches have got to prioritise engaging with research from trusted sources, such as the EEF, or from cognitive science-backed teacher courses, such as How Teaching and Learning Happens from Academica University of Applied Sciences. Also, harnessing that internal expertise can be really powerful. So sharing examples of high-quality practice from within your school. So mechanism group C now is developing teaching techniques. And I think, again, this is an area where instructional coaching can be really, really central in doing this. So we're going to talk a little bit about social support. So that might come through peer observation, through conversation, through sharing practice, and that can improve implementation, but also well-being as well. It's that sense of belonging and psychological safety and culture, that tangible sense of the way we do things around here. And when instructional coaching is done really well, coaches serve as continuous partners in improvement. So what are the key kind of practical strategies that we can have for coaches? Well, I really like the use of triads. So very often, if we're thinking of sort of one-on-one instructional coaching, that can be really hard for schools to actually implement because of resources, because of time. So I think triads work really well. So you'd have a coach, you'd have a teacher, and you'd have a peer who collaborate together. It strengthens learning motivation, reflection, and transfer, while also reducing that cognitive load and the emotional pressure that can sometimes be associated with one-to-one coaching. There's also really strong evidence base from research on social learning and peer support and cognitive apprenticeship showing that small group structures like triads leads to much deeper, more sustained teacher change. So the key with triads is that they increase that social support, which the EF identifies as a key PD mechanism, which states that peer support boosts motivation, normalises challenges, improves problem solving, and supports those long-term implementation. So that kind of collaboration can include co-planning, jointly analysing evidence of student learning, observing one another, and sustained cycles of reflection. I used to work for the company Iris Connect, who also utilised video in this way really, really well. So they would have a film club where they watched a video that was filmed of a teacher in that school, of their practice, and they would sit and discuss about what they noticed and sort of deconstruct that, if you like, and reflect on what that means through guided reflection for their own practice. So lots we can learn from that set of mechanisms. And then the last set of mechanisms for practical strategies now in my last couple of minutes is prompts and cues and action planning. And again, this is another group of mechanisms where instructional coaching can really help, especially when assisted by technology. So we've got prompts and cues. So the EF emphasises that reminders like emails, posters, checklists, they prevent the decay of training. And coaches can naturally provide prompts in regular cycles, such as post-session reminders, cue cards for routines, or the embedding of micro prompts within lesson plans as well. Action planning, it can also be really effective with coaching as well. So all coaching sessions should routinely end with an action plan, such as in tomorrow's lesson, I will, so that. Because coaching only matters if it leads to behaviour change in the classroom. And the role of the coach here is to help the teacher turn that advice into deliberate, manageable action. And by taking the time to action plan, that creates that commitment from the teacher that actually they're going to do something with that feedback. And then finally, self-monitoring. And that increases what I like to term is intentionality and reflection. And again, video coaching is really powerful here because teachers can observe their own behaviour. They can track progress over time. Because we know that teachers operate in really complex, cognitively demanding environments. And therefore, rewatching things back on a video, you're going to notice things that you did not see during that lesson because you were making a million decisions at that same time. So keeping that kind of intentionality, that reflectiveness, that self-awareness, it can really strengthen agency as well because it turns teachers into analysts of their own behaviour, not the passive recipients of advice. Even using things like pre-lesson self-monitor checks can help here as well, where the teacher completes a quick mental checklist. Am I ready to stand still for instructions? What's my cold call plan today? And that self-monitoring, it cultivates ownership, which is the strongest driver of sustained improvement. So what does that look like as a coaching cycle? You can see it here. I'm calling it mechanism-aligned coaching cycle. So your coaching session might start with a period of retrieval and refocus from where you were last time. You might have a period of learning from the success from the goal that you had last time. There's a time for diagnosis and setting of goals using the 3 Ps that we talked about before. There's now a professional dialogue where you build knowledge in a shared mental model of where you are and where you're going and the practical steps of how to get there. That might include the coach modelling something or watching a video or some co-planning or some mapping. Then there's the opportunity to rehearse in low stakes environment with feedback until you've gained that confidence, which may lead to habit formation and automaticity in the classroom. And then we've got that action plan with the prompts and cues at the end, which is the commitment that you get from the teacher, turning the advice into actual action as well. And then rinse and repeat. So you implement it over the week or the fortnight or the half term, whatever the frequency of your coaching cycles is, with that self-monitoring between and then leading into the next coaching cycle. So these are quite small on the PowerPoint, but these are my recommendations for school leaders. And I'm not going to read these out for you. I'll just give you a chance to look at them. I think the important thing here is that, we understand as leaders that teacher expertise develops over years, not weeks. And lots of research on expert teachers suggests that expert practice is intuitive, but it's underpinned by deep domain knowledge, automatic in routine decisions, and adaptive to complex contexts. And what that means is that coaching has got to be, if it's done well, has got to be grounded in rich mental models of instruction. And on that note, I think I'm now going to bring in my colleague, Professor Jim Heal, who's going to talk to you about mental models. Thanks, Jim.
Thank you, Haili. Can you hear me? Can everyone else hear me? I just want to double check.
Yes.
Looks like I can.
Yeah.
Perfect. Okay, well, before I dive in, I just wanted to say a quick word about Haili herself. Haili, congratulations on joining the Academica as a professor. You've certainly influenced me and inspired me for a number of years now with your own wonderful work within instructional coaching and other arenas. And I just wanted to name that I'm proud to now be able to call you a colleague and to continue to call you a friend. So I just wanted to name that, Haili, and to wish you all the best in this role. I'm going to speak explicitly about mental models. This is something that Haili has touched on in a number of occasions over the course of her presentation. And one of the things that, a couple of things that I heard Haili say that really resonate with what I'm hoping to share with you today is this question of there is a difference between the amount of professional learning opportunities that teachers receive and the mechanisms of that professional development. And the second thing would be to say that if we are going to improve the practice of educators, we need to move simply from knowing to instead doing. And this is where the role of mental models come into play most explicitly. And so one of the things I'm going to explore today is the idea of two specific ways of thinking about mental models in particular. The first is this question of what do we mean by a mental model in the first place? And indeed, for those of you that have encountered the ideas of schema, how do they differ in large part from what we have come to know as schema? And so first things first, what do we even mean by a mental model? Well, if you understand what it means to make a ham sandwich, or even if you understand what it means to be able to play a Beethoven sonata, you are at any point in time activating some mental model of what it takes to do that activity to an optimal degree. And in large part, the mental models that we utilize in the day-to-day of our lives are often sort of hiding in plain sight. We don't necessarily think when we get into a car and begin to drive it, or when we begin to brush our teeth in the morning, that that is indeed grounded in a mental model of what it means to do such a thing successfully. Now, some of you may recognize this gentleman. He was measured within the last World Cup, in which it was determined how many times he had scanned the field of play to build a picture in his mind of what he needed to do in order to succeed on that field. Now, the average number of scans that a typical player engages in within the course of a 90-minute game of football was in the low 100s. It turned out that Messi completed 680 scans in a single game. So what is Messi doing in this instance? He is building a picture in his mind, and he is utilizing that picture to be able to act accordingly. And so in this regard, mental models can be built in real time, but they can also be built over time. And this is where, connecting back to Haili's work, that mental models can and indeed be coached towards improvement. So that is in large part where I'm going to go with today's presentation. Now, as I mentioned, the first important thing to note is that there are differences between mental models and what we would refer to as schema. While schemas provide a kind of conceptual understanding, think of this as receiving a working from a recipe book in which the steps are clearly laid out, and the manner in which you have to understand the kind of theoretical composition of those ideas is indeed your schema. It's something that allows you, as you build it, to adopt a conceptual understanding of the world. By comparison, mental models, in a sense, provide us with a kind of procedural guidance. This is not so much being able to just simply follow the recipe, but rather to be able to pivot, to be able to adapt, to be able to roll with the punches of different moments within any activity in which you're engaging, so that you can arrive at a level of optimism and optimal performance. So as this picture suggests, we're looking at it as more like a well-trained chef who can taste decide that this might need more salt, decide that it might need a different level of flavor, and in so doing can shape their activities in accordance with wanting to achieve that optimal end. And so in this regard, mental models allow us to sort of see more so that we can do more. It allows us to make spontaneous sense of the things that we're encountering. In other words, to move from moment to moment and to be able to react from moment to moment. As schema does, mental models do allow us to notice patterns and make predictions and then to act on those predictions. It does, as I said, allow us to adjust and pivot. And most importantly, I would argue, it is to do all of the above in service of a desired goal. Unlike schema, which is one way of describing the way in which our knowledge becomes more sophisticated and interconnected, mental models dictate, so what, now what? What would we then do with the model that we have in our mind so that we can drive towards the thing that we want to achieve? And so I'm going to explore one such mental model today to be able to illustrate for you what we mean when we talk about such mental models and how they can inform practice. And that mental model is what we refer to as the activating the prior knowledge of learners. So I'll give you a bit of a primer on what we mean by prior knowledge and how it can be built and supported within regards to learners. And then I will show you a mental model that will enable you to kind of hold this idea and use it to good effect. So one of the first ways I think about the role of prior knowledge in learning is to say that we make sense of the world via our existing understanding of the world. As I mentioned, none of us gets up in the morning as if we are born afresh into the world and have no sense or point of reference for how we are supposed to do things. We know how to brush our teeth. We know how to get into our car and drive it with a high degree of automaticity. So what is happening there in terms of our cognitive processes? Well, when we think about that when it comes to schema, here's one visual that might help us to understand it. Let's imagine you sense something in the world. The thing that you sense is a four-legged creature covered in fur that goes woof. You reach into your long-term memory and you ask yourself and you say to yourself, I'm pretty sure I've seen something before that is furry and woofy and four-leggedy. And that enables you to make sense of what you're seeing through schematic connection and relationships. So you get to yourself, you get to be able to say, well, this is not as catty as a cat. It's not as beary as a bear. Balloon animals aren't alive and unicorns don't exist. So the doggiest looking thing I'm looking at right now is in fact a dog. And in so doing, you're placing that notion of dog into an interconnected network of ideas that we know of as schema. By contrast, activating prior knowledge as a mental model, as I said earlier, is something closer to procedural guidance. Imagine that your car breaks down and you need to work out how to fix it. It turns out that one of the wheels has gone flat. And so in order to be able to succeed in that series of actions, you must have a mental model for the steps that would be required. And indeed, you would need an idea in your head of what the eventual outcome needs to be. In this case, a newly fitted tire and a return to your journey that you had hoped to continue. And yet not all prior knowledge is necessarily equally useful to us. There are ways in which, in fact, prior knowledge can hinder learning. In this sense, we think of prior knowledge as compounding or having a compounding effect on the quality of learning. And when we have faulty understanding or faulty prior knowledge, there's a very good argument to suggest that that begets subsequent faulty understanding and existing knowledge. So I'll give you a quick example of what this looks like from my own life. My daughter, Nora, when she was around 3 years of age, we were looking through a picture book and she pointed at an aeroplane and said, look, Daddy, that's a helicopter. Now, her understanding of that with regards to her prior knowledge was relatively close to being accurate in its designation of each of these flying objects. She was able to determine that both are man-made, they're modes of transportation, they fly in the air, and they carry people. And yet, the more fine-grained differentiation between what makes an airplane and a helicopter wasn't quite there yet. So in that sense, if she had gone on to spend the rest of her life assuming that an aeroplane is a helicopter, that would indeed be somewhat problematic. By contrast, if Nora, my daughter, went on 20, 25 years later to become an aeronautical engineer, then it could be fair to say that she would know everything that makes an aeroplane and everything that makes a helicopter a helicopter. And if she were then to engage in designing and supporting the design of such a vehicle, then she would be in a position to offer and draw upon her mental model and her prior knowledge of those crafts. And again, if she was to design such an aeroplane or a helicopter, still believing that they were necessarily one and the same thing, then I'm sure that none of us would actually want to fly in either of those modes of transportation. But it is not all doom and gloom. Prior knowledge can indeed also help learning. This might seem like a counterintuitive thing to say, but in fact, prior knowledge actually makes us better at solving problems. It doesn't just make us better at making meaning or developing greater understanding. It actually makes us better at critical thinking. And so I'm going to do a quick experiment here to show you what this means. So I'm going to show you on the next slide a riddle. And I'm going to show you what the answer to that riddle is once you've had a chance to think of it for yourselves. And then I'm going to share with you some data that was derived from the riddle and how it was used in a study. And from there, I hope to be able to demonstrate to you how prior knowledge actually makes us better at solving problems. So here is the riddle to begin with, and see if you can work out what the answer to this riddle is. I'll give you a few moments to read. Okay, so start having a think about what you think the answer to this riddle might be. And in a few seconds' time, I will reveal the answer. Okay, so if any of you were saying that the treasure hunter, upon entering the cave, ought to collect sand or stones or shells from the beach and to leave them in a trail behind him such that he could follow that trail back out, then you, congratulations, answered the riddle correctly. Now, what happened when researchers utilized this riddle was something that is sort of remarkable, really, when we think about how we make sense of the world and solve problems. What they noticed was that when they asked students from the United States to solve the riddle, 75 roughly % of them got it correct. When they asked students from China to solve the same riddle, then only 25% of students got it correct. Why? Because students from the United States were able to rely on their understanding of the fairy tale that is Hansel and Gretel. And so we might be supposing, well, how does this show? How do we know for certain that that was the underlying factor? Well, this is where research really wows us with its ingenuity. What they did next was to reverse the situation by way of choosing a fairy tale from the Chinese culture and then developing a riddle that derived from that fairy tale. And when they did so, the trend reversed. Under the new condition in which the riddle drew on a Chinese fairy tale, 75% of students from China got the riddle correct, and only 25% of students from the United States got it correct. Now, this is incredibly compelling to me because it speaks to notions of what I might call instructional equity, equity around who gets to think and who gets to think deeply and who gets to learn. And so if you think about the notion that if prior knowledge was some kind of currency within the classroom, whose currency is acceptable, whose currency is accepted? We might think about this in terms of everything from students who are English language learners to students who have special educational needs, and even to the extent that students bring with them their own cultures and histories and race and ethnicity and identities and sexualities, all of which shape the way they are able to make sense of the world. And so if you don't happen to have those things, and you're a Chinese student who has to think in Hansel and Gretel terms, or you're a student from the United States who has to think in the Chinese fairy tale terms, that's not really on that student. That's on us as educators to be able to acknowledge and honor and activate the prior knowledge that all of our learners bring into learning spaces. And so one way of thinking about this is that prior knowledge is a bit like adding a series of pieces to an emerging puzzle. The more information that you acquire, the more it needs a kind of existing picture to stick to. It needs a place to land. And in order for that to be true, we need to have the kind of commensurate prior knowledge that would allow us to have that new information stick. But even that is no guarantee that we're going to prepare our learners in the right way. Just because you are activating the prior knowledge of learners does not mean that you are activating it in such a way that it is relevant, that it is accurate, and that it is fit for use. Because we can build schema and mental models in a corrupted way. And let's face it, our learners are going to activate prior knowledge whether they like it or not. The question is, are we supporting them to activate it with coherence in ways that lead to new learning? And as I said at the outset, something as seemingly simple as making a ham sandwich can also fall foul of this kind of corruption. You might think that asking someone to take a piece of bread, then take a piece of ham, and then take another piece of bread and put the piece of ham between the two pieces of bread is a relatively straightforward process. But that is not necessarily always the case. And so, with this in mind and our understanding of the activation of prior knowledge as significant to the learning process, I'm going to turn to an example mental model for prior knowledge activation. This is taken from mine and Rebecca Berlin's book, Mental Models. And in this instance, we refer to this mental model as the rock climber, as a way of understanding prior knowledge activation. Now, I think I'm going to fall into the same trap as Haili here with the lack of animation. So if a lot of this is appearing all at once, then again, my apologies if the animation does not allow for the more gradual release of information. In this instance, when I think of the rock climber mental model, I think of three things. I think of prior knowledge as the foothold. This is the place from which new understanding can launch. I then think of new knowledge as the handhold. That is the new information that we are reaching towards, that our prior knowledge is propelling us towards. And I consider the teacher's job to help students bridge the gap between the foothold of their prior understanding and the handhold of what they are coming to know. So this, in my mind at least, can follow a relatively straightforward process that indeed, to Haili's point earlier in her talk, is something around which we can coach teachers to improve. So 3 steps could be adhered here. First, you begin with the end in mind. Where do I want my students to actually end up? And the precision of this will determine the precision with which they get there. The second step is to say, well, where are my students starting from? What do they know or don't know? What kind of prior knowledge do they possess? Is that varied in relation to the kinds of students that you have in the room? And how can you ensure there is a relatively even playing field as far as the foundational understanding that would be required to engage in that new learning? And then finally, this is where the question turns directly to the teacher. How will I get them from one place successfully to the other? So I'm going to give you an example of what this might look within an actual instructional example. So let's start with this question of where I want my students to end up. And the rhetorical point here would be to say to yourself, what precisely is the information I want students to take from this experience? So if you look to the right-hand side, you could ask yourself, well, if I'm teaching the basic principles of division to a group full of elementary students for the first time, the core concept I want them to take from this is that they should understand that division is the equal distribution of a quantity. You take the whole, you split it up, and every single part of that whole is equal in nature. So what can we say in terms of our starting point of our students? Question now becomes, what can I reliably say my students already know that's relevant to the concept at hand? So again, if you look to the right-hand side, if your core concept is I want my students to understand that the division is an equal distribution of quantity, then you could reliably say that my students already know how to play games that involve dealing cards. It may be that you have seen them engage in this. It may be that you've already played games with them by other means, with other pedagogical significance, in which you know that to be the case. And so now you get to this very interesting stage where you get to say to yourself, how can I use one to introduce the other? And so for here, you might ask yourself, well, how can I invite my students to see that these concepts share the same underlying structure, even though they might appear different on the surface? Indeed, being able to deal cards, 15 cards between 3 people, is the same as being able to demonstrate in mathematical language that 15 divided by 3 is 5. And so you could easily imagine how you might be able to use the beginning foothold of an understanding of how to deal cards so that everybody gets the same amount. And after all, elementary school students love the idea of fairness and ensuring that everyone gets what they want. And then being able to translate that into a mathematical function that they can then draw upon to be able to deepen their understanding. It is at this point that you can then start to play around with the contours of this. You can change the surface features in an anticipation that your learners will be able to activate the underlying architecture. So imagine at this point, you would say to your learners, well, what would happen if I changed the total number of cards to 20? How many would each receive under that new condition? We're now making certain that we've moved from the starting point of some prior knowledge that you know them to be able to understand, to a point of being able to represent that prior knowledge in its newer form, to then being able to further deepen and ensure that students are engaging not just with the surface features of the idea, but indeed the architecture that lies beneath the surface. And so in large part, when I think of this idea of prior knowledge activation, you're essentially asking yourself, are my students picking up what I'm putting down? As opposed to, and indeed thinking freshly, what do students already know that will enable them to pick up what I'm putting down? And for me, this is one of the most significant differences in terms of loosely appreciating prior knowledge activation instead of intricately understanding it. And more importantly, and this is where the mental model comes in, going beyond understanding to be able to enact it as a prescribed set of processes and actions that lead towards a desired outcome. That is where the mental model plays its role, and that is where mental models begin to show their power. So in conclusion, I would name a few things. The first is that we all do indeed possess mental models that shape our everyday actions, and teaching should be no different. Secondly, mental models vary in sophistication, just like schema does, but it can and does refine over time. And finally, and this loops me back to a lot of what Haili's work brilliantly illustrates, is that improving teachers' mental models for more effective instruction can indeed be achieved via effective coaching, because mental models themselves can be refined over time. And so at this point, I will kick it back to Haili, who's going to take us home with what does this all mean for the world of instructional coaching itself. Haili, over to you.
Thanks, Jim. Okay, so bringing all of this together then, we just heard that brilliant session by Jim there about mental models, and I want to just marry up both of our work now because I think they are so intersected actually. And the first thing I'm going to say is kind of highlighting really what the role of a coach is. And I very much see an instructional coach's role as being somebody who has got the potential and the power to deliberately shape teachers' mental models, not just their behaviour. Because what Jim's presentation emphasised is that mental models help teachers to see more so that we can do more with what we see. And included in that is the idea that it enables us to notice patterns, make those rapid in the moment decisions, and then adjust our instruction dynamically. And that means that coaching shifts from a do this strategy actually to much more meaningfully understand the underlying structure of teaching decisions. And the implication here is that our coaching conversations must make teacher thinking visible. And they've got to allow teachers the space, the scaffolding, and the support to be able to refine the reasons behind their reactions and their actions, not just the actions themselves. And I think sometimes we can be in danger of focusing on kind of a behaviourist perspective, very much of this is the thing, do the thing, without that bigger, deeper understanding of the meaningful decisions why we're doing those things. So it's that idea of doing the right things at the right time for the right reasons. And that's what it's all about. I think importantly as well, coaches need to differentiate between schema and mental models. And Jim very, very clearly there separated those two things. And we use them quite a lot interchangeably, I think, when we're talking about the science of learning. And what Jim's presentation told us is that schema is more about that conceptual understanding, whereas the mental models is the procedural guidance for that real-time decision making when it comes to coaching. So the implication here for instructional coaches is that we must essentially help teachers build both. So we must have that conceptual clarity of what a good one looks like. So that shared mental model, what makes an explanation effective, for example. The work I've been doing in my own trust in Merseyside at the moment is around building a set of 9 common lesson principles across our trust, all the way from primary up to FE. And what makes a really effective lesson where students all have the opportunity to think hard, with those desirable difficulties thrown in, and with students feeling that success as well that thinking hard brings. So building that shared mental model is incredibly important to have that conceptual clarity. But this is where something like a procedural playbook could come in, for example, as well. So behind my 9 lesson principles in my trust, we also have what we call an instructional playbook, which is the how. So we don't just understand the why and the what, we understand the how as well, how to actually deliver these things live in class. And again, to go back to the EF research, that mirrors their distinction between building knowledge and developing teacher techniques. I think it's Daisy Christodoulou who has spoken about that knowing-doing gap in the past, and that's what instructional coaching can really close. It can be that bridge between the two. And also as well, I think the kind of messy scanning that Jim talked about before really highlighted to me that experts constantly scan and interpret the environment in front of them. And expert teachers absolutely do the same. So the implication here for me is that coaching should focus on improving teachers' moment-to-moment decision-making. And coaches can do that by helping teachers develop what we term as their instructional perception. So that might mean things like noticing micro behaviours, their own and the micro behaviours of pupils as well. Again, why video can be so powerful, although it might make us cringe to watch it back when we first start doing that, and to see the things that we do and the things that we say habitually without even thinking. It also might involve identifying possible misconceptions and planning and scripting our questions so that we can address those misconceptions head on and avoid them as well. And then also knowing when to pivot. And I think becoming an adaptive expert is, it's a really complex thing to do. It can take years, but an instructional coach absolutely has a role to play there. And I think some of that role can be played out with things like using approximations and scenarios, mapping of mental models, talking about cause and effect and the decisions that teachers have made and what might have happened if they'd have changed those decisions slightly. So we might use video-based coaching as part of this to replay and have slow motion analysis, kind of football style, if you like. Because as we know, when we're in the classroom making those decisions that are really high stakes, we're not going to be able to notice everything that's around us. I think Jim also talked about prior knowledge a lot in that as well, and it really struck me, actually, that prior knowledge of teachers is really central. Assessing their mental model of what effective teaching and learning looks like, or their own experience and how that's fed into that, is really, really central. And as coaches, we've got to help our teachers activate their prior knowledge and also to diagnose it as well. And Jim mentioned about faulty prior understanding leading to faulty new understanding. And we can sometimes see that with early career teachers who come into our schools, for example, and this might be their first teaching job. So they will have a pre-existing mental model made up of prior knowledge of what they think makes an effective teacher. And we might have to unpick that at times as well. One classic example of that I experienced was speaking to a newly qualified teacher who was telling me about how they thought that, students should be up walking around the room doing carousels, lots of student centered learning. And I had to kind of share a lot of cognitive science research with that teacher as well, because they were going off their own experiences in school, which was during quite progressive time of student faced learning. So had to unpick a lot of the mental models there. So as Jim talked about, that prior knowledge being the foothold, the new knowledge being the handhold, and that teacher is the guide bridging the gap. Actually, the coach here can be the guide bridging the gap. So we've got to train teachers in thinking about their own prior knowledge and their own kind of ideas and decision making for the instructional sequences that they use, but also connect the new ideas and the suggestions and the advice and the models we might be giving them to some of their existing schema as well. And coaching has got to emphasise, I think, that checking of assumptions about student understanding that we can sometimes have as teachers. And that can be uncomfortable at times as well. And that's why you need that psychological safety and that credibility that the EF talk about between the coach and the coachee. And finally, from me, my kind of last point on this about mental models and instructional coaching. I think our coaching has got to prioritise the underlying structures rather than the surface features of teaching. And what I might mean by that is it's those deep structures, and we've got to help teachers in identifying those pedagogical deep structures. Jim talked about it in terms of dealing cards and division. So we've got to ask our teachers, what's the principle behind this technique? When might that apply? And when should it not be used? And that also prevents those lethal mutations of strategies that we sometimes see as well. So I'll give you an example of that from my own work at the moment. We're focusing on checking for understanding very much across my trust. And we're focusing on 3 particular strategies: show me boards, co-calling, and think, pair, share. And what I'm seeing when I'm going around classrooms in our trust is that teachers are focusing on one particular strategy in terms of checking for understanding, and they're shoehorning that strategy into every part of the lesson. They're not seeing those 3 strategies as a repertoire. So it's about, how we help teachers do the right things at the right time for the right reasons. And a lot of that comes from those discussions, actually, of why this technique, why here, and what is the impact on pupils going to be there. And that will then help to avoid those lethal mutations and the sort of tick box approach to shoehorning techniques in, looking at those deep underlying structures. So all it remains for me to say, really, I'm going to bring Jim back on, is thank you so much for joining us this evening. I know it's been a long day for many of you on a Thursday. Many of you will now be looking forward to going home and having wine if you were in Europe, because it is the evening. If you're in America, we have our wonderful friend and colleague Meg Lee, I can see, joining us from, I can never say Maryland right. They always laugh at me. Is it Maryland, Jim?
Maryland.
Maryland.
Took me 10 years to learn how to say that.
You're such a yank now, Jim. Honestly, it's I cannot say it. But there you go. Sorry, Meg, for the terrible
Happy Thanksgiving,
pronunciation.
by the way.
Oh, is it Thanksgiving? And Meg and Helen have joined us from the US. How lovely is that? Happy Thanksgiving, all our US colleagues and friends. Now, I just do want to bring attention to this at the end of this webinar, which is our amazing course that we have at Academica University of Applied Sciences, How Teaching and Learning Happens, which has been written and presented by our colleague, Carl Hendrick, and Jim himself as well. And a lot of the things we've been talking about tonight, we've talked about needing the why, haven't we, Jim, behind things? things and the prior knowledge when it comes to mental models, this is your why. So as Carl often says, you can't join the dots unless you can see them. And it's really difficult to make great decisions in the classroom and working alongside a coach to hone those decisions if you don't understand the science of learning behind the principles that you're using. Do you want to say anything about the course, Jim, because you've been involved in it?
Yeah, I mean, at the highest level, without sort of blinding everyone with the sort of weedsy part of it, I think the general sense is that this is an online interactive way of exploring pretty much comprehensively many of the ideas that were found both in How Learning Happens and How Teaching Happens, those two books. And one of the ways I would describe it is almost this level of what if those books could talk and what if you could talk back to them? And so the idea here being that Carl and I attempt to share a number of these principles, to provide examples of those principles in practice, and then indeed invite teachers themselves to activate that understanding by saying, what might this look like where your feet are at, where your students are, and where your needs are most acutely felt. And so we're really proud of it. We think it's a great resource for teachers. And for those of you that are digging into this, we are very open to and would love to hear what you think. And for those of you that have not yet learnt about this, the QR code on the screen is an opportunity for you to do just that.
Thanks, Jim. And I'll add as well that we are adding modules as we speak on implementation, how school leaders can use the course as part of their holistic PD offering, and also in instructional coaching and how it fits into that as well. So it's kind of a one-stop shop really for leaders for PD. So all that remains for me to say really is thank you so much for joining me. We were going to hold this event live in Amsterdam. Jim is there as we speak now, and I am in the lovely Merseyside in Liverpool. But we had lots of demand from the international audience, both in the US, Australia and the UK. So we decided to hold it online. If you've missed this webinar or you've got colleagues who might be interested, after this webinar finishes, probably tomorrow, I will be sending you links to access it on YouTube as well. So please do revisit us. And if you've got any comments, any questions, please do contact us on LinkedIn on the Academica International page as well, and we'll be happy to engage. Thank you, everybody, and good night.
Thank you.